The infamous Yulin Dog Meat Festival is coming up again this year in June. There will of course be protests and campaigns trying to shut it down and trying to end the practice of eating dogs. Will we ever be able to shut down the Yulin Dog Meat Festival for good? And when can we end the practice of eating dogs altogether? So in this video, let's take a careful look at the practice of eating dogs as well as the different arguments for and against it. I understand that this is a controversial topic, which makes it even more important to talk about, because when it comes to controversial and taboo issues, people tend to form a rather instinctive opinion or take a rather instinctive position without necessarily knowing exactly why they form that opinion or take on that position. So let's try and take a careful look at the different perspectives and arguments that are involved in this topic, not just the emotional arguments, which are indeed very important, but also other arguments as well. So I'm going to be using my usual listing format, and my list this time will contain 10 things about the practice of eating dog meat. Number 1. Who does this? Let's be very clear about this. Although the Yulin Dog Meat Festival takes place every year in China, but not all Chinese people eat dogs. It is only in certain regions of China do some people occasionally eat dogs. Even for these people, dog meat is not an everyday dish. It is more of a specialty dish or a delicacy. So it is certainly not true to say that all Chinese people eat dogs, and the same can be said about Koreans, Vietnamese, Thai, Indonesians, Filipinos, and just basically Asians overall. Not all Asian people eat dogs. In fact, there are plenty of dog lovers in Asia who are fiercely against the practice of eating dogs. Now, the practice of eating dog meat dates back 4,000 or so years, and it is not just in Asia. Dog meat was eaten in Europe and in Africa at some point in history as well. Although in the modern day and age, in this 21st century, this is primarily an Asian phenomenon. While the practice of eating dog meat goes back 4,000 years, the history of large-scale organized opposition against eating dog meat is only about 40 years old. It started somewhere in the 1980s, and we're going to talk about some of these very successful campaigns later on in this video, so please keep watching. Number 2, why should we talk about this? Well, the reason I have already indicated in the opening of this video, the need to carefully look at different perspectives and arguments. For instance, there does appear to be a certain level of complexity and even confusion in the positions that the protesters take. When we carefully look at the protests and carefully listen to the protesters, their positions and arguments seems to be rather different. Some of them are presenting an emotion-based argument, saying that there is something intrinsically wrong with the act of eating dog meat, that there is something categorically unacceptable about taking a piece of dog meat, putting it in the mouth, chewing it, and swallowing it. Their position is to advocate for a complete ban. But others seem to be only protesting against the cruelty, the torture, the pain and suffering which result from unregulated slaughtering processes of dogs, which is a very different position. Logically speaking, people with grave concerns regarding the pain and suffering that results from unregulated slaughtering processes of dogs may not be calling for a complete ban of eating dogs, but rather the advancement of proper legislation and regulations in order to eliminate or at least minimize unnecessary pain and suffering in the slaughtering and preparation processes of dog meat for human consumption. And others are protesting something different yet again. They are protesting against the industrialization, the commercial and profiteering aspects of the dog meat markets. So even these protesters who are standing together shoulder to shoulder are not the same. They are protesting against different things based on different reasons and motives. And that is why if we want to take a reasonable position in this rather sensitive, controversial, taboo topic, we need to understand the complexity of it so that we are not taking a position based only on impulses and instincts, but rather we choose our position based on well-reasoned arguments and careful thinking. The purpose of this video is not to argue for or against the practice of eating dogs. I simply want to take a look at the different arguments and perspectives involved in this topic. So now let's look at some reasons and arguments, some of which are strong, some of which are not so strong, for why it is morally wrong to eat dogs. So number 3, why is it wrong to eat dogs? The intelligence argument. The intelligence argument is really a series of arguments that we hear from activists, campaigners, and protesters. These arguments center on the main theme that it is wrong to eat dogs because dogs are so intelligent. Proponents of this argument would cite scientific studies showing that dogs can understand, interpret, and respond to human language's emotions, and that their brain structure is complex, and that they are just overall an intelligent species. And certainly referencing published scientific studies does make this argument seem very strong. However, there are a few issues with this argument. Let me highlight two here. First, this notion that it is okay to eat stupid animals but not okay to eat smarter animals, well, where is this idea even coming from? Why is this a rule? And even if we buy into this logic that you can only eat stupid animals but not intelligent animals, well, this intelligence argument is still problematic because we now know that there are many other species which are equally or more intelligent than dogs, which we are quite happy to eat. For example, we now know that pigs are more intelligent than dogs on average, and yet most people generally take no moral issues with eating bacon. Why is that? So this intelligence argument is, to say the least, logically dubious. Is there a better argument for why eating dogs is wrong? Well, number 4, the cruelty argument. This argument basically says eating dogs is wrong because, compared to other species and livestock, the slaughtering process of dogs is unregulated, contains too much cruelty and unnecessary pain and suffering. This is a very fair argument, and it is based on legitimate concerns. Even dog meat eaters can appreciate that. As things stand of now, there is much unnecessary pain and suffering in the slaughtering process of dogs, which makes it morally wrong to keep eating dog meat. Another argument, the utility argument. This one basically says it is wrong to eat dogs because dogs are so useful to us. While the utilitarian values of dogs are certainly very observable, because dogs can be trained to perform various tasks for people, this argument, however, does have a few issues. First, utility is a very subjective thing. What I perceive to be very high in utility, you might perceive it as low in utility, so there may not be a clear agreement concerning how useful something is. In addition, if we are to attach so much moral value to the concept of utility, saying that whatever is useful is also important, then one could argue the fact that dogs can function as food is actually of very high utility to those who eat it. And if something useful is also important, doesn't the perceived utility of dog meat as food justify the act of eating it? Furthermore, let us not forget that there are so many different types and breeds of dogs, some of which are very capable of fulfilling those traditional utilitarian purposes, like being a guard dog or a guide dog or a police dog. But there are also certain breeds of dogs which cannot serve those traditional utilitarian functions. Can those ones be eaten then? And stretching this argument even further, can people intentionally create or breed certain types of dogs which by design cannot serve any other utilitarian functions except for being a meat dog? Can those be eaten? And if we think about it, creating specific breeds of dogs which fulfill certain criteria is exactly what we have been doing for companion dogs. We breed them in such a way that they are rather useless in many other regards except for being a lovely and cute companion. So why can't we do that for meat dogs as well? Nevertheless, this utility argument at best suggests that people should stop eating certain breeds of dogs, but it is not a very good argument for why we should stop eating dogs altogether. Next argument, the emotional argument. This is a straightforward argument which basically says it is wrong to eat dogs because we like dogs, because we have this powerful and precious emotional connection with them and they with us, and that's why it is wrong to eat them. This is a genuine, simple, and honest argument which is hard to refute with logic. Sometimes the simplest argument is honestly the best. If someday the practice of eating dogs disappears, it is probably due to this emotional argument. It seems like that this argument is already working to increasingly persuade people out of the practice of eating dogs. There are more and more people in Asia who now have pet dogs, and they are starting to form this emotional connection. And as such, those people, and there are more and more of them, will not engage in the practice of eating dogs. However, this argument should also be viewed in light of two potential limitations. First, this argument only works on people who do have this emotional connection with dogs. For people who grow up having a pet dog, they see dogs as companions and friends and family. But for people who grow up seeing dogs being bred for meat, they see dogs simply as food. So if they do not have this emotional connection, then this argument would not be efficacious. Second, as many authors have pointed out, this emotional argument is also known to be selectively empathetic. That is, we have great empathy for dogs, but not for many other animals, which in and of itself does seem to be rather arbitrary and biased. Number 7, the need argument. This argument says it is wrong to eat dogs because there is no need to. Maybe hundreds of years ago, during famines, there was no other food source, and people had to resort to eating dogs, so be it. But now, we have an abundance of food. There is no need to eat dogs anymore, and therefore, doing so is morally wrong. Well, just one point of refutation here. We do many things we don't really need to. We don't need to drink fine wines, but we do. We don't need to go to the moon, but we did. So is there really an equivalency between needing to do something and that something being morally justified? It just might not be that clear-cut. Point number 8. Who are the people making all these counter-arguments? It might be interesting to point out that it is not those Asian dog eaters who are writing opinion pieces and articles in order to make all these counter-arguments. It is many times vegetarian and vegan authors who are doing so. It is them who are doing an excellent job pointing out the hypocrisies and logical inconsistencies in the arguments put forth by the proponents who are trying to end the practice of eating dogs. Of course, the reason that these authors are doing that is not because they want to justify the act of eating dogs, but rather they are arguing that we should stop eating all animals, instead of engaging in selective empathy or raising arguments which in fact do not stand up to scrutiny. Because truly, if we care so much about the well-being of dogs, why shouldn't we care about the well-being of other animals as well? Let me point out 2 interesting books on this topic for you to potentially read. Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows by Melanie Joy, and Eating Animals by Jonathan Foer. They have made a very clear case as to why we should stop eating all animals, not just dogs. I am not necessarily advocating that, but I do recommend both books. Next point, can we tell others what to eat? Speaking of vegans and vegetarians, let's consider this. To what extent is it okay for us to tell others what to eat and what not to eat? I have a very good friend who is vegan, and he suggests to me sometimes that I should consider stopping eating meat. If you also have a close friend who is vegan, then probably you have experienced this as well. I believe that most of us would consider these friendly suggestions to be fair and reasonable. It is nice that they are suggesting to us something which they believe is good and beneficial. But what if they are doing more than just suggesting or encouraging us to change what we eat? What if they are pressuring and pushing and compelling us to change what we eat? Would we still consider that to be fair and reasonable? Another way to think about this question is this. We know that most people in India do not eat beef because they consider cows to be holy. Would it be okay if Indian people would form some kind of an organization, some form of an NGO or IGO to put political pressure and use economic sanctions in order to get the Europeans and Americans to stop eating steaks and hamburgers? Would you consider that to be fair and reasonable? We know that most people in Muslim nations do not eat pork. Now, can they, through NGOs or IGOs, apply economic and political pressure to get the Europeans and Americans to stop eating pork and bacon? Would that be fair and acceptable? Now, if we feel that it is not fair and reasonable for Indians, Muslims to do what I just suggested as a hypothetical, then why should the mostly Western campaigners and organizations use political pressure and economic sanctions and other forms of leverages to compel the Koreans and the Chinese to stop eating dogs? Bearing in mind that these campaigners' conviction that dogs should not be eaten is as genuine and sincere as Indians' conviction that beef should not be eaten and Muslims' conviction that pork should not be eaten. Last point, 1988 Summer Olympics in South Korea, 2002 World Cup in South Korea, and 2008 Summer Olympics in China. What do these three events have in common? Well, in all three cases, Western pressure, mostly from Americans and Europeans, to boycott these events unless the hosting nations banned the practice of eating dog meat. And of course, Korea and China did not want to lose visitors and tourists and money, so they had to do something in response. Now, what did they do? 1988, Korean Olympics. This was more than 20 years ago, and Korea was not yet the economic powerhouse in Asia as they are economically strong today, so they basically complied. The Korean government issued a complete ban on dog meat for the entire duration of the Summer Olympics. This was unprecedented, and this never happened again since. 14 years later, in 2002, World Cup, same thing, Western pressure, threat to boycott, but this time the Koreans resisted. They stood up for themselves and said, if someday we stop eating dogs, that's because it is our choice. If we continue to eat dogs, that's also our choice. Whatever choice we make, the point is, it is our choice to make. So this time, they did not give in to the pressure. Sure, some dog meat markets were closed and some dog meat restaurants had to stop operating during the World Cup, but it was not a complete ban. And after the World Cup, things went back to normal. Another 6 years later, 2008, Summer Olympics in Beijing, China. Yet again, same thing, Western pressure, threat to boycott, and the Chinese government basically did the same cosmetic thing for appearances. They closed down a number of dog meat restaurants in Beijing, and that was it. So a couple of patterns emerged from these incidents. First, the Western pressure, which was tremendous in 1988, decreased. In 1988, it was a huge thing, which was why the Koreans basically caved, issuing a complete ban. In 2002, there was still pressure. It was still pretty big news back then, but it was certainly not as overwhelming as it was in 1988. And in 2008, the boycott threat against the Beijing Olympics was very loud, but it was more focused on sensitive political issues. The dog thing was a very minor secondary voice in the boycott threat. It barely made the news. You probably don't even remember that there were people who wanted to boycott the 2008 Beijing Olympics because of the dog thing, because there were so many more sensitive political issues which led to the threat of boycott. Those things made the news. The dog thing more or less flew under the radar, unless you paid attention to it, otherwise you probably didn't even notice. And another pattern is that the reactions from these Asian countries also became more, let's say, nuanced, diplomatic, politically correct, and more of a window dressing response. In 1988, it was a complete ban. In 2002, it was just a symbolic gesture. And in 2008, it was even a smaller gesture, just for appearances. So what does this mean? On the one hand, this suggests that the West is getting more tolerant and less bothered with all this as time progressed. On the other hand, it seems like these Asian countries are simply getting better at playing the game. Now, every time an event occurs, whether it is an international sporting event or this Yulin dog meat festival, everybody knows that the campaigners and activists will protest, they will demonstrate, they will threaten, and they will boycott. People know that now, they anticipate it, and they expect it. So these event organizers respond, they play the game, and they learn to play it better every time this happens. And isn't this exactly what has been happening since 1988? And now let's not forget, next year, 2020 Olympics, in Asia again, this time in Japan. Now you must be thinking, oh thank God, at least the Japanese don't eat dogs. Well, that's true, but the Japanese have been doing something else which the West has been very upset about. These Japanese people hunt and kill and eat whales. Now some would argue that that is even worse than eating dogs, and the West has been using political pressure and economic sanctions to try to get the Japanese to stop. And so far, they haven't. I am sure, as we speak right now, somewhere campaigners are gearing up to protest and boycott the Tokyo Olympics next year because of this whaling thing. So let's see to what extent that is going to happen. So, we have covered quite a few things in this video regarding the practice of eating dog meat. To clarify again, the purpose of this video is not to argue for or against this practice, but rather the purpose of this video is to take a careful look at the different arguments and perspectives regarding this interesting and yet somewhat taboo topic. Let me end this dog eating video with a dog quote. every dog has his day. Of course, we can take this quote to refer to different things, because the dog in this quote could mean, I don't know, actual dogs, or people, or countries, or cultures, or civilizations, or other things. But regardless of what we take this quote to mean, whether it's about actual dogs, or people, or countries, or cultures, or civilizations, I would reckon that this saying will continue to ring true in our world, because that is probably how the world is supposed to be. No one dog can always be the lucky dog. No one dog can be the top dog forever, because after all, every dog has his day. So what do you think about all this? Where do you stand on this wide spectrum of different positions? What are some of the arguments that I covered in this video that you strongly agree or disagree with? Do you think it is okay to eat dogs, or do you think it is simply categorically wrong to do so? If it is wrong, why is it wrong? If you think it is okay, do you think it is okay to eat all breeds of dogs or just certain breeds of dogs? Do you think it is fair for some people to compel and coerce others into eating or not eating something? Is there any hypothetical situation in which you might be willing to consider eating a piece of dog meat? What would that hypothetical situation be? Or perhaps you are more in the vegan camp, with the view that it is wrong to eat all animals. As always, I invite you to leave your thoughts and comments down below, but please keep them civil and respectful. Thanks so much for watching this Ranywayz random video. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.